The crack of the rifle was a splinter of sound against the vast, indifferent silence of the Dakota Badlands. It came from the ridge line, a puff of gray smoke against the bruised purple of the rock. Wood exploded from the stagecoach's frame, a hand's breadth from Yates Caldwell's head. He didn't flinch. He was already moving, leveling his Winchester, his eyes scanning the ambush point. "Get down," he yelled, his voice a low growl that cut through the sudden chaos. Inside the coach, a woman screamed. The driver, a grizzled old-timer named Gus, cursed as a second shot tore through the canvas roof. The four horses, already skittish from the punishing heat, screamed in terror, threatening to bolt and splinter the coach against the canyon walls. "Hold 'em steady," Gus Yates shouted, firing a shot toward the rocks to suppress the attacker. Yates Caldwell was not a man given to panic. In the 6 years he'd served as foreman for John Morgan, he had faced blizzards that could freeze a man solid in minutes, stampedes that shook the earth, and the quiet desperation of drought. This was different. This was calculated. For the past 3 months, the Morgan Ranch had been plagued by a series of misfortunes. Fences cut, wells poisoned, small herds of cattle vanished. Now an ambush on a supply run. This was an escalation. 2 more riders broke from the cover of the rocks, masked by red bandanas, their horses charging down the scree slope. They weren't trying to stop the coach. They were coming alongside it. Yates fired again, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. One of the riders cried out and swerved away, his arm dangling uselessly. The other kept coming. The man was lean and quick, his movements economical. He drew his pistol and fired not at Yates or Gus, but at the traces. One of the lead horses stumbled, whinnying in pain. The coach lurched violently, throwing Yates against the rail. He recovered his balance, his jaw tight with fury. This wasn't rustling. This was a message. Gus fought the reins, his knuckles white. "Can't hold 'em, Yates. They're going to tear the whole rig apart." The remaining rider was beside them now, his face a mask of grime and grim intent. He ignored Yates, his eyes fixed on the coach window. With a sudden lunge, he reached inside. The passenger, a stout businessman from back east, yelped as the rider grabbed for the leather valise on his lap. "My samples," the man shrieked. "He's taking my samples." Yates didn't have a clear shot. He holstered his rifle and vaulted from his seat, landing with practiced ease on the back of the nearest wheel horse. The animal bucked, but Yates's thighs were like iron clamps. He urged the horse forward, closing the gap between the coach and the attacker. He was close enough now to smell the sour sweat on the man and see the cold fury in his eyes. He launched himself from his mount, a flying tackle that sent both him and the masked rider tumbling from their saddles into the red dust of the road. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He rolled, coming up with his pistol in his hand, but the rider was just as fast. The man's boot caught him in the ribs, a sharp, blinding pain. The valise had fallen between them. The rider scrambled for it, but Yates was faster. He kicked it away and lunged, grabbing the man's gun hand and slamming it against the ground. The pistol flew free. They grappled in the dust, a desperate tangle of limbs. The rider was wiry and strong, his fingers digging into Yates's throat. Black spots danced in Yates's vision. With a final desperate surge of strength, he bucked and threw the man off, drawing his Bowie knife as he rose to one knee. The rider saw the glint of steel, and his eyes widened. He scrambled backward, then turned and fled, disappearing into the rocks where his horse was waiting. The other ambusher was already a distant speck on the horizon. Panting, Yates forced himself to his feet, the pain in his ribs a sharp, insistent throb. He retrieved his pistol and the rider's. Gus had managed to calm the frantic horses. The businessman was poking his head out of the window, his face a pasty white. "Did you get him? Is it safe?" he stammered. "He's gone," Yates said, his voice raspy. He holstered his weapon and bent to pick up the valise. As he did, his eyes caught a glint of silver in the dust. He picked it up. It was a woman's locket, small and oval-shaped, tarnished with age, but intricately carved with a pattern of climbing roses. The chain was broken. It must have fallen from the rider's pocket during their struggle. He tucked it into his waistcoat, intending to turn it over to the sheriff in Willow Creek. It was evidence, and perhaps a clue to who was behind these relentless attacks. He handed the valise back to its owner. "You all right in there?" I believe so. "Thank you, young man. That was remarkably brave." Yates merely nodded, his mind already churning. Whoever these men were, they were getting bolder. And John Morgan was running out of time. The whistle of the train split the air like a thunderclap, a sound Yates Caldwell normally associated with progress and connection to the world back east. Today, it was the sound of an impending complication. He stood on the platform of Willow Creek Station, consciously trying to slow his breathing. The dust of the ambush had been washed from his clothes, but a faint purple bruise was blooming on his ribs beneath his clean shirt. He'd told Morgan about the attack, omitting the detail of his own close call. The old man had enough to worry about. John Morgan was a good man, a man who had carved a life out of this harsh land with grit and integrity. But time had weathered him. After burying 2 wives, the loneliness had settled deep into his bones. His solution, born of pragmatism and a quiet desperation, was a mail-order bride. A woman from Ohio, he'd said, a former schoolteacher looking for a new start. Morgan had asked Yates to meet her as a courtesy to escort her to the ranch while he finalized a cattle deal. The train hissed to a stop, steam billowing across the platform, momentarily obscuring the disembarking passengers. And then, through a swirl of white vapor, he saw her. Time, which had galloped by in a blur of violence just yesterday, now froze. The clamor of the station, the porters yelling, the children crying, the greetings of reunited families, faded into a dull hum. Josephine Miller. The name was a ghost on his lips. It couldn't be. The hair, a cascade of spun gold, was now pinned in a sensible bun beneath a modest blue hat. But it was the same hair he'd once threaded his fingers through under a sprawling Ohio oak tree. The profile, delicate and proud, was the one that had haunted the edges of his dreams for 12 long, silent years. She descended the train steps, her gloved hand resting lightly on the conductor's arm. She clutched a small valise, and her simple traveling dress spoke of practicality, not fashion. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, scanned the crowd, searching for the man she had agreed to marry. A man old enough to be her father. Yates couldn't move. His boots felt as if they'd been nailed to the planks. Memories sharp and bittersweet flooded him on the clumsy sweetness of a first kiss, promises whispered in the dark, and the hot tears on her face the day his family's wagon had rolled west. And then, the silence. The letters he'd sent week after week that were met with nothing but an aching, unanswered void. Her gaze swept across the platform and snagged on his. Her lips parted. The color drained from her face, leaving it as pale as porcelain. The valise slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud. For a single stretched heartbeat, the world consisted only of the 60 feet of steam-filled air that separated them. A porter jostled past him, breaking the spell. "Pardon me, sir." Yates swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat and forced his legs to move. Each step was a mile a year. He stopped before her, the man he was now facing, the woman she had become, both of them strangers, haunted by the ghosts of the children they had been. "Josephine," he said. His voice was rougher than he'd intended a stranger's voice. "Yates." Her own voice was a whisper, exactly as he remembered it, as soft and clear as a mountain stream. I had no idea." He bent and retrieved her valise, the motion pulling at his bruised ribs. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing her gloved ones. A jolt like lightning passed between them. "I work for John Morgan," he said, the words tasting like ash. "He asked me to escort his bride to the ranch." Her eyes widened a storm of confusion, and something else hurt brewing in their depths. "You work for Mr. Morgan?" 6 years now. The words were automatic a defense. He's a good man. Was any man good enough for her? "I see." She looked down, her hands twisting nervously. "This is unexpected." He needed to get them away from the prying eyes of the station, away from the impossible weight of this moment. He tipped his head toward the dusty main street where his wagon stood waiting like a patient beast of burden. "I should get you to the ranch. Morgan's expecting you. It's about an hour's ride." "Of course." Her composure returned a mask, sliding into place, though her eyes remained troubled. "Thank you for meeting me." They walked in silence, the space between them charged with a dozen unspoken questions. He helped her into the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal, and stowed her valise. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, he was acutely aware of the clean lavender scent of her soap, a scent that cut through the dust and grime of Willow Creek and transported him back 12 years. He clucked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward. They were leaving the station behind, but Yates knew with a sudden, devastating certainty that they were heading straight into a storm far worse than any ambush. As they moved, something shifted in his waistcoat pocket. The locket. He'd forgotten all about it. He reached in his fingers, closing around the cool metal. He should give it to the sheriff. He glanced at Josephine. Her face was turned away, her profile etched against the vast, unforgiving landscape. He hesitated. Perhaps showing it to her first was a courtesy. "Strange thing happened yesterday," he began, his voice strained. "We were ambushed on the road. One of the riders dropped this." He held it out to her, resting it on his calloused palm. "I was going to give it to the sheriff, but I thought maybe you—" He trailed off. Josephine had turned, and her eyes were fixed on the silver locket. The mask of composure she wore shattered. Her hand flew to her mouth, and a soft, wounded sound escaped her lips. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Like I said, one of the attackers dropped it." The cold dread began to seep into Yates's bones. He didn't understand her reaction. "You're a thief." She breathed, her eyes flashing with accusation and a profound, soul-deep hurt. "On top of everything else, you're a thief." "What are you talking about?" She snatched the locket from his hand, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It was the last thing she gave me before she died. And before that." Her gaze lifted to meet his, and the accusation in her eyes was like a physical blow. "Before that, it was yours. You gave it to me the day before you left. You told me to keep it until you came back for me." Yates stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. He remembered. A 16-year-old boy, clumsy and earnest, pressing his most prized possession, his own mother's locket, into the hands of the girl he loved. And she had told him in a tear-stained letter months later that she had lost it. Now here it was, dropped by a masked man who had tried to kill him. And she thought he was the thief. The misunderstanding was so vast, so layered with a history of pain and silence, that he didn't know where to begin to unravel it. "Josie, I didn't steal it," he said, his voice low and urgent. But she wasn't listening. She was staring at the locket, cradling it in her palm, as if it were a wounded bird lost to a past she now believed he had desecrated. The hour's ride to the Morgan ranch suddenly felt like a lifetime sentence. The silence in the wagon was a living thing, a third passenger wedged between them, heavy and suffocating. The clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed road was the only sound, a relentless metronome marking the passage of time toward a future neither of them had imagined. The wind dry and relentless carved ripples into the red sand that glowed like embers under the unforgiving sun. Finally, Josephine spoke, her voice devoid of its earlier warmth, polished smooth by shock and anger. "How could you, Yates, of all the things to steal?" "I didn't steal it." He kept his eyes fixed on the horse's ears, his knuckles white on the reins. "I told you. One of the men who ambushed the supply coach dropped it. I fought him. It fell from his pocket." A convenient story. The injustice of it stung sharp and deep. Why would I lie about that? "Why did you stop writing?" she shot back, turning to face him fully. The fire, he remembered, was there in the depths of her sky-blue eyes, but now it was banked with years of hurt. A man who can vanish without a word, who can break a promise to a 16-year-old girl without a second thought, is capable of anything. The accusation landed like a punch to his bruised ribs. "I wrote to you, Josie. Every week. For 6 months I wrote. When you never answered, I figured you'd moved on. Found some town boy who wasn't hauling his life west in a rickety wagon." Confusion warred with disbelief on her face. "What are you talking about? I never received a single letter." "I sent them. And I waited for them," she countered, her voice softening fractionally, the anger momentarily eclipsed by an old, familiar pain. "For over a year, I went to the post office every day. I waited. Until I finally had to accept that you had forgotten me." The wagon hit a rut, jostling them close. The faint scent of lavender filled his senses, a ghost of a memory. He steadied the horses before he spoke, the pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed beginning to shift in his mind. 12 years of silence. 12 years of believing he'd been forgotten while she believed she'd been abandoned. "Someone kept them from you," he said, the thought taking shape as he spoke it. "My letters. They were never delivered." "Who would do such a thing?" "Your father never approved of me," he said slowly, voicing a suspicion he'd held long ago. "Thought I was too rough. No prospects." Josephine shook her head, a flicker of loyalty in her eyes. "He was stern, but he wasn't cruel. He would never have done that. He wouldn't have known how." They lapsed back into silence, the impossible question hanging between them. Far ahead, the black hills rose against the horizon, a jagged spine of stone against the sky. The land was vast and empty, a place where secrets could be buried deep. "Why did you come here?" she asked eventually, her tone more curious than accusatory now. "To the Dakota Territory. My father heard there was good ranching land. We settled north of here near the Belle Fourche River. He didn't elaborate on the brutal reality, how the land had taken everything, how his father had succumbed to pneumonia that first winter, his body racked with coughs that echoed in the tiny drafty cabin. He didn't mention how his mother, shattered by grief, had remarried a cold, hard man named Garrick, prompting Yates to leave home at 18 with nothing but a saddle and a chip on his shoulder. And Mr. Morgan? "Luck," he said simply. "I was drifting looking for work. His foreman had just quit. He took a chance on me." Yates's grip on the reins relaxed slightly. For all its harshness, this land had also given him a purpose. Morgan had given him a home. "He seems kind in his letters," Josephine said, as if trying to convince herself. "Established. Reliable. All the things Yates hadn't been. All the things he'd spent the last decade trying to become." "He is those things," Yates confirmed, the words heavy with an irony that cut him to the bone. He hesitated, then decided she deserved the whole truth, at least about the man she was about to marry. He's also 53 years old, and he's buried 2 wives. Her head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. He never mentioned that. Not his way. Doesn't dwell on the past. He saw the flicker of alarm in her face and answered the unspoken question. It wasn't the ranch. The first died in childbirth years ago. The second, influenza, 4 years back. Life out here can be hard. I see. Her hand still clutching the locket twisted in her lap. They crested a rise, and the Morgan Ranch spread out in the valley below. It was an impressive sight, a sprawling main house of hewn logs, a large barn, several outbuildings, and neat lines of corrals. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the endless sky. It's larger than I expected, she murmured. Morgan built it from nothing. Yates said, a note of pride in his voice. This place was his life too. 20 years of hard work. And you, Yates? She asked, her voice quiet. Did you build a life for yourself too? Is there a wife, children? No. The single word was stark. He didn't tell her about the few tentative courtships, the women whose faces had blurred and faded because none of them were hers. Ranch life doesn't leave much time for courting. They were close now, rolling toward the main gate. In minutes, this strange, painful interlude would be over. She would meet John Morgan, and the door to their shared past would close for good. He found himself slowing the horses, stealing a few last seconds. Josie, he said, the old name slipping out soft and familiar. Are you sure about this? Marrying a man you've never met? She looked out at the endless sea of grass, whispering secrets on the wind. When she finally answered, her voice was steady, but edged with a sadness that mirrored his own. I'm 28 years old, Yates. An orphan with no inheritance and no prospects. Mr. Morgan is offering me security. He's offering me a new beginning. She turned to him, a faint, sad smile on her lips. What else should I be looking for? Love. He wanted to scream. The kind we had. The kind I've never found again. Instead, he said, You deserve to be happy. Happiness is a luxury, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. I'll settle for contentment. He guided the horses through the gate. A figure emerged from the main house, John Morgan. Dressed in his Sunday best, his silver hair neatly combed, a welcoming smile on his weathered face. For what it's worth, Josephine said softly, so only he could hear, I never forgot you, Yates. Not for a single day. Before he could process the words, before he could find a response, Morgan was there, standing beside the wagon. Miss Miller Morgan, said his voice a warm, gentle baritone. He executed a courtly bow that seemed at odds with his rugged surroundings. Welcome. I trust your journey was comfortable. It was Mr. Morgan, thank you. Josephine replied, her voice regaining its composure. She smiled a polite, distant smile that wasn't for Yates. Your foreman was most attentive. Caldwell's my best man, Morgan said, clapping Yates on the shoulder with genuine affection. In every sense of the word. Knew he'd see you here safely. He turned his warm gaze back to Josephine. Come, you must be exhausted. Mrs. Abernathy has your room prepared. As Morgan led her toward the house, Josephine glanced back over her shoulder. Her eyes met Yates's, and in that fleeting look, he saw a maelstrom of regret, confusion, and longing. Then she was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the porch, stepping into a life that should have been his. Yates stood motionless, the reins slack in his hands. He had delivered his home into another man's arms. And as he watched the door close behind her, he felt the cold, hard certainty that the masked rider on the road was not the only thief in this story. Something precious had just been stolen from him, and he had handed it over himself. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of strained civility. Yates buried himself in his work, riding out at dawn and returning after dusk, seeking the kind of physical exhaustion that left no room for thought. But the ranch, once his refuge, was now a constant reminder of what he had lost. Every glance toward the main house, every glimpse of Josephine tending the small garden she'd started near the kitchen, was a fresh twist of the knife. Morgan, blessedly oblivious, seemed pleased that his foreman and his fiancée got along. He insisted Yates join them for supper each evening, turning the parlor into a chamber of quiet torture. "You two must have a lot in common, both hailing from Ohio," Morgan remarked one night, tamping tobacco into his pipe. Yates and Josephine exchanged a look across the table. The lie of omission had grown heavier with each passing day. "We grew up in the same town, actually," Josephine said, her voice even. Morgan's eyebrows rose. "Well, I'll be. Small world." "We knew each other as children," Yates added, feeling the need to control the narrative. "My family moved west when I was 16. We lost touch." It was a half-truth that felt like a whole lie. Morgan accepted it with a nod. But later that night, as Yates was heading to his cabin, the older man intercepted him on the porch. The moon was a silver sliver, casting long shadows across the yard. "Caldwell," Morgan said, his voice low and serious. "Is there something more I should know about you and Miss Miller?" Yates stiffened. "Sir, I'm not a blind fool, son. There's history there. I need to know what it is." The truth. It was the only honorable path left. "We were sweethearts," Yates said the words, feeling thin and inadequate to describe what they'd had. "First love. It ended when I left." Morgan studied him for a long, silent moment. "And has it ended for you now?" "Yes, sir," Yates lied, the word tasting like bile. "That was a lifetime ago." "And for her?" "You'd have to ask her that." Morgan nodded slowly, his gaze unreadable. "I appreciate your honesty. You're a good man, Caldwell. I've always known that." The trust in Morgan's voice was a heavier burden than any lie. A week into this tense charade, a new figure rode into the valley. Silas Blackwood. He was a man who was buying up land all around the territory, a man whose ambition was as vast as the prairie itself. He'd made Morgan a low offer for the ranch months ago, which Morgan had flatly refused. Blackwood was handsome in a severe sort of way, dressed in a tailored black suit that looked out of place and yet perfectly natural on him. He dismounted with a fluid grace and approached the porch where Morgan and Josephine were sitting. Yates, repairing a bridle nearby, watched from the corner of his eye an instant, and inexplicable dislike coiling in his gut. Morgan Blackwood said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I was in the area. Thought I'd see if you'd reconsidered my offer. Times are tough. I hear you've had some trouble." "My troubles are my own." Blackwood Morgan said, his tone curt. "The ranch is not for sale." Blackwood's gaze slid past Morgan to Josephine, and his smile was a thin, predatory curve. "And this must be the lady of the house." "A pleasure, madam. Silas Blackwood." He took her hand, bowing low over it. "You bring a touch of civilization to this wild place." Josephine withdrew her hand, a polite but firm smile on her face. "Josephine Miller. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's eyes lingered on her for a moment too long before turning to Yates. "Caldwell. Still playing watchdog, I see." There was no warmth in the greeting, only a quiet challenge. "Just earning my keep," Yates said, his voice flat. "Indeed." Blackwood turned back to Morgan. A pity you're so stubborn. A man needs to know when to fold his hand. This land has a way of breaking those who hold on too tightly. He tipped his hat. Miss Miller? With another lingering look at Josephine, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a palpable tension in his wake. I don't like that man, Morgan muttered, watching him go. Vultures circling. Yates said nothing, but he felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The timing of Blackwood's visit, his veiled threat, it felt connected to the ambush to the poisoned wells. It felt like the source. Later that day, Josephine sought him out at the corral. Yates, we need to talk. She clutched the silver locket in her hand. He'd noticed she never took it off. About the letters. I can't stop thinking about it. He leaned against the fence, the rough wood a comfort against his back. Nothing to be done about it now. But don't you want to know the truth? She pressed her eyes, searching his. I've been thinking about Millie Carson, the postmaster's daughter. She always had a crush on you. The name sparked a vague memory of a girl with hopeful eyes. You think Millie? Her father ran the post office. She sorted the mail. It would have been easy. It was a plausible theory, a simple, cruel act of girlish jealousy that had irrevocably altered 2 lives. The thought was a bitter pill. It doesn't change where we are now, Josie. Doesn't it? She stepped closer, her voice dropping. What if we've been living lives that were never meant for us? All because of a lie. Before he could answer, a shout came from the direction of the north pasture. One of the hands, a young man named Billy, was galloping toward them, his face ashen. Yates, it's the north herd, they're gone. Fences cut clean through, and we found Sam. Yates was already moving, grabbing his rifle from his saddle. What about Sam? Billy swallowed hard, his eyes wide with horror. He's dead, Yates, shot in the back. The world narrowed to a single sharp point of focus. This was no longer about poisoned wells or veiled threats. It was about murder. As he swung into the saddle, he caught Josephine's eye. The fear on her face was a mirror of the cold rage building inside him. The game had changed, and Silas Blackwood had just made it personal. The investigation was a frustrating exercise in futility. The sheriff from Willow Creek, a weary man named Jebediah Kane, rode out to the ranch, asked his questions, and scribbled in his notepad. The tracks of the rustlers were muddled, lost in the rocky terrain. There were no witnesses. Sam was buried in the small plot behind the main house, another ghost to haunt the Morgan ranch. Sheriff Kane pulled Yates aside before he left. Off the record, Caldwell, you got any ideas? Silas Blackwood, Yates said without hesitation. He wants this land. He was here just before it happened, making threats. Kane sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Wanting and doing are 2 different things. Blackwood's slick. He's got half the town in his pocket, and he's always got an alibi. I can't touch him without proof. He lowered his voice. Be careful. The last man who crossed Blackwood over a land dispute. His farm burned to the ground. Ruined him. The sheriff's warning only hardened Yates's resolve. If the law couldn't touch Blackwood, he would find another way. He began his own quiet investigation, riding the boundaries, talking to hands on neighboring ranches, piecing together whispers and rumors. He learned that Blackwood's methods were always the same, a generous offer followed by a series of escalating misfortunes for those who refused until they were forced to sell for pennies on the dollar. One evening, searching for a stray calf, Yates stumbled upon a remote, forgotten corner of the territory, a place where the prairie gave way to scrub and rock. There, half overgrown with sagebrush, was a small, neglected cemetery. 2 weathered headstones stood crookedly in the dirt. He dismounted, driven by a morbid curiosity. The names were nearly erased by time and wind, but he could just make them out. One read, Elias Blackwood. The other, Sarah Blackwood. There were no dates, just the names. It was an odd place for a grave far from any settlement. He filed the information away, unsure of its significance, but feeling the faint chime of a distant bell. Back at the ranch, the atmosphere was thick with grief and fear. Morgan seemed to have aged a decade overnight. He moved through his days like a man in a trance, the fire in his eyes reduced to dull embers. Josephine became his shadow, her quiet strength a buttress against his despair. She managed the household with a firm but gentle hand, her presence a small pocket of warmth in the growing cold. The tension between her and Yates remained a constant, unspoken hum beneath the surface of their daily interactions. The truth of the stolen letters lay between them, a bridge half built over a chasm of lost years. One night, unable to sleep, Yates found her on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, the silver locket clutched in her hand. "It was my mother," he said, stepping out of the shadows. The words came out unbidden, a confession he hadn't planned to make. Josephine looked up, startled. "What was your mother?" "The letters. It had to be her." He leaned against a porch post, the pieces finally clicking into place. "She never thought you were good enough for me. No family, no money. She told me once she'd saved me from making a terrible mistake." When Millie Carson's name came up, I remembered. My mother was friendly with her. It would have been easy for her to persuade Millie to intercept things. Josephine stared at him, her eyes luminous in the moonlight. The revelation was both a relief and a fresh wound. It wasn't a jealous rival or a cruel stranger, but his own mother who had authored their pain. "All these years," she whispered, "all those years we lost. We can't get them back, Josie." "No," she said, her gaze dropping to the locket in her hand. "We can't." She looked up again, her expression resolute. "But we don't have to lose any more time to lies." She took a deep breath. "I can't marry him, Yates. I can't marry John. Not now. Not loving you as I do." The words hung in the still night air, a truth so powerful it seemed to make the stars brighter. Hope, fierce and dangerous, surged through him. "What will you do?" "I'll tell him," she said. "Tomorrow. He deserves the truth." But tomorrow never came. The next morning, as Yates rode out to check the southern fence line, he saw the smoke. A thick black pillar rising from the direction of the hay barn. He spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Fire. It was the one thing a rancher feared above all else. By the time he reached it, the barn was an inferno. The ranch hands were already there, a disorganized bucket brigade, fighting a losing battle against the flames. Morgan stood apart, his face a mask of utter defeat, watching his life's work turn to ash. "The horses," Yates yelled. "Did anyone get the horses out?" Billy, his face streaked with soot, shook his head. "We couldn't get close, Yates. The whole thing went up too fast." Yates didn't hesitate. He soaked his bandana in a water trough, tied it over his face, and ran toward the roaring mouth of the barn. "Yates, no." It was Josephine's voice, a scream of pure terror. He ignored it. Inside, the heat was a physical blow. Smoke burned his eyes and lungs. The panicked screams of the trapped horses were a sound from hell. He could see them, shadows dancing in the flames, kicking at their stalls. He worked with desperate speed, unlatching doors, driving the terrified animals out into the yard. One of Morgan's prize stallions was trapped in the back, a fallen beam blocking its path. "Easy, boy, easy," Yates crooned, trying to calm the animal as he strained to move the heavy, smoldering timber. A section of the roof groaned above him. He had seconds. With a final agonizing heave, he shifted the beam just enough. He slapped the stallion's flank, sending it bolting for the door. As he turned to follow, the roof gave way. A shower of burning embers and a heavy crossbeam crashed down, and the world went black. He woke to the scent of smoke and lavender. His head throbbed a dull, insistent drumbeat. He tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pushed him back down. "Lie still," Josephine's voice said, soft but firm. "You have a concussion. The doctor said you're lucky to be alive." He opened his eyes. He was in his own cabin. Josephine was sitting on a chair beside his bed, a basin of water on the table next to her. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes red-rimmed but clear and focused. "The barn," he rasped, his throat raw. "It's gone," she said quietly. "All the horses got out. Thanks to you." Her voice broke. "I thought you were dead, Yates." When the roof came down, he reached for her hand, his fingers finding hers. "I'm too stubborn to die." "You're a fool," she said, but her fingers tightened around his. A brave, reckless fool. They were silent for a moment, the crackle of the dying fire outside the only sound. Morgan, Yates asked. "He's broken. He says it's over. He's going to sell to Blackwood." The words were a death knell. Yates struggled to sit up, ignoring the shooting pain in his head. "No. We can't let him win. This is what he wanted." There's nothing left to fight for, Yates. The ranch is crippled. There's always something to fight for. He looked her in the eye, his gaze intense. "I am not letting that man take this place. Not after he killed Sam. Not after he almost killed me." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his head spinning. "I need to talk to the sheriff. The graves I found, Elias and Sarah Blackwood. I need to know who they were." "The sheriff left for the state capitol this morning," she said. "He won't be back for a week, and you're not going anywhere." He slumped back against the pillows, defeated for the moment. Josephine wrung out a cloth in the cool water and placed it on his forehead. Her touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the violence that surrounded them. "Then we have a week," he said, his voice a low growl. "A week to find the proof we need before Morgan signs everything away." He looked at her, at the strength and determination in her eyes. "Will you help me, Josie?" She didn't hesitate. "I'm not letting him win either." She leaned closer, her expression fierce. "But you have to promise me something. No more reckless foolishness. We do this together, and we do it smart." He nodded, the pain in his head momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of purpose. Outside, the ashes of the barn were still smoldering. But here in this small cabin, a different kind of fire had just been lit. Over the next few days, a fragile truce settled over the ranch. Morgan, moving like a ghost, began the grim task of sorting through the wreckage, his face etched with a grief so profound it was painful to witness. Silas Blackwood sent a messenger with a formal written offer, a pittance, an insult, and a note expressing his deepest sympathies. Morgan left it unanswered on his desk. Yates, ignoring the doctor's orders to rest, began his quiet war. With his head bandaged and his ribs tightly bound, he moved with a grim determination. He and Josephine became a team, their shared purpose erasing the last of the awkwardness between them. She was his eyes and ears in the main house, listening, observing. He was the legs riding out, asking careful questions, piecing together the puzzle of Silas Blackwood. His first stop was the land office in Willow Creek. The clerk, a man whose loyalty Yates secured with a silver dollar, pulled the old territorial survey maps. He found the original Caldwell plot, the land his father had claimed. and right next to it, the original Blackwood claim. They had been neighbors, a fact his father had never mentioned. The Blackwood plot was now owned by a conglomerate Blackwood himself secretly controlled. Next, he sought out some of the old-timers men who had been in the territory for decades. Over whiskey, in a quiet corner of the saloon, he listened. An old rancher named Henderson, his memory lubricated by the liquor, finally gave him the story. The Caldwells and the Blackwoods, Henderson mused, staring into his glass. That was a nasty business. Happened almost 20 years ago, right after your family arrived. Both claimed the same stretch of land down by the river, best water access for miles. What happened? Yates asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Went to the territorial court. Your pa had papers all legal and proper. Elias Blackwood just had his stake in the ground. The judge sided with your father. Blackwood lost everything. He was a proud man. It broke him. Henderson took a long drink. Folks say he went a little crazy after that. There was a confrontation, shouting, threats. A few days later, Elias Blackwood was found dead. Shot. Some said it was suicide. Others. He trailed off, shrugging. No one ever proved anything. His wife Sarah, she packed up her boy and disappeared. Never saw them again. The boy, Silas. The pieces slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about land or money. This was about revenge. A vendetta 20 years in the making. Blackwood wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to salt the earth of his enemy. And his enemy wasn't John Morgan. It was Yates Caldwell. Morgan and his ranch were just collateral damage, a tool to inflict the ultimate pain. Yates rode back to the ranch, the truth a cold, heavy stone in his gut. The sins of the father. His father hadn't just been a shrewd settler. He had been a ruthless one, a man who had driven another to his death. And Yates was now paying the price. He found Josephine in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Abernathy pack away the good china. She saw the look on his face and immediately followed him outside. "What is it?" she asked. "What did you find out?" He told her everything. The land dispute, the court case, the death of Elias Blackwood. She listened in stunned silence, her hand going to the locket at her throat. "So all of this? The attack, Sam, the fire. It's all because of you, because of your father." "It seems so," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Blackwood is destroying Morgan to get to me." "Then you have to tell John," she insisted. "He needs to know why this is happening. And say what that my family is, the reason his life is in ruins, that the man he trusts is the son of his enemy's enemy." Yates ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "He'll kick me off this ranch so fast." "He deserves the truth." "The truth won't save the ranch," he shot back, his frustration boiling over. He lowered his voice, the anguish clear in his tone. "Josie, I need to handle this. Me and Blackwood. It's the only way." Before she could argue, the sound of an approaching wagon interrupted them. It was Silas Blackwood, arriving unannounced. He pulled up in front of the house, his expression a mask of polite concern. "Morgan," he called out as the old man emerged onto the porch. "I came to see if you'd made a decision. I have the papers drawn up. We can settle this today." Morgan looked from Blackwood to Yates, his face a gray mask of indecision and exhaustion. "Give me until tomorrow." Blackwood Morgan said, his voice weak. Blackwood's gaze flickered to Josephine, a proprietary gleam in his eyes. "Of course. A man needs time to set his affairs in order." He then looked directly at Yates, a small triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Caldwell. A word." Yates walked stiffly toward him. "A terrible tragedy," the fire Blackwood said, his voice a low murmur. "It seems this land has a way of cleansing itself, getting rid of things that don't belong. His eyes were cold and hard. Sometimes a man is better off cutting his losses and moving on. Before he loses something he can't replace. His gaze shifted pointedly toward Josephine, who was watching from the porch. The threat was unmistakable. "You stay away from her," Yates growled. Blackwood's smile widened. "The choice isn't yours to make, is it? Once Morgan signs, everything here will be mine. Everything and everyone." He picked up the reins. "Tomorrow, Morgan. Noon." He tipped his hat and drove away. That night, the air at the ranch was thick with impending doom. Morgan had locked himself in his study. Yates paced his small cabin like a caged animal. He had to end this. He couldn't let Morgan lose his home, and he couldn't let Blackwood get his hands on Josephine. There was no proof, no legal recourse. There was only one option left: a final confrontation. He was checking his pistol when Josephine entered his cabin without knocking. Her face was pale but determined. "You're going after him, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. "I have to." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "We have to. I am not sitting here waiting to find out if the man I love is alive or dead. Whatever you're planning, I'm part of it." She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You told me we do this together. This is together." He looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her face, and knew he couldn't argue. But he couldn't risk her life either. He needed a plan, something that would draw Blackwood out, but keep her safe. "All right," he said slowly, his mind working furiously. "But you do exactly as I say." His plan was desperate, a long shot. He knew Blackwood would be in the saloon in Willow Creek tonight, celebrating his victory. Yates would confront him there, force a confession. But he needed leverage. He needed something Blackwood wanted more than the ranch. He looked at Josephine, at the silver locket she wore. An idea terrible and dangerous began to form. The locket was the key, not just to their past, but to Blackwood's as well. It was the last thing Blackwood had touched during the ambush. It was from Riverdale, Ohio. Blackwood had been there. He must have known of their connection. The locket wasn't just a random piece of jewelry. It was a message. "He knows who you are," Josie Yates said, the realization dawning. "The ambush, the locket. He didn't just happen to have it. He got it from our hometown. He knows you're my weakness." The kidnapping wasn't random. It was a lure. And tonight, Yates would use the same bait to set his own trap. He just prayed they would both live through it. The saloon in Willow Creek was a haze of smoke, sweat, and cheap whiskey. A tinny piano battled against the boisterous laughter of cowboys and prospectors. In the center of it all, at a table piled with bottles, sat Silas Blackwood. He was holding court, accepting congratulations for a deal that wasn't yet done, a king surveying his newly conquered territory. Yates pushed through the swinging doors, and a hush fell over the room. He was a stark figure, his face grim, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. He ignored the other patrons, his eyes locked on Blackwood. Caldwell Blackwood said, a lazy smile spreading across his face. He gestured to an empty chair. "Come to concede defeat. Have a drink. On me." "I'm not here to drink." Yates said, his voice low and carrying in the sudden silence. "I'm here to talk about your father." The smile vanished from Blackwood's face. His eyes went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." Elias Blackwood Yates pressed, stepping closer to the table. "And my father. And the land your family lost." Blackwood's knuckles were white where he gripped his whiskey glass. "You're drunk, Caldwell. Get out before I have you thrown out." "It's over, Blackwood. I know everything." It was a bluff, but a good one. Before Blackwood could respond, the saloon doors swung open again. It was Josephine. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. She walked directly to their table, every eye in the room following her. "What is this?" Blackwood demanded, rising to his feet. "She's with me," Yates said. Josephine looked at Blackwood, her expression unreadable. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, and she held up the silver locket. Blackwood stared at it, his composure finally cracking. A flicker of something rage-pain crossed his face. "Where did you get that?" "You should know," Yates said. "Your man dropped it when he tried to kill me." He leaned in, his voice a whisper of steel. "You went all the way back to Ohio, didn't you? You found this learned art history. You brought her here using Morgan's advertisement as a cover. You knew she was the one thing that could hurt me more than losing any ranch." Blackwood lunged, not at Yates, but at Josephine, grabbing her arm. "You meddling fool," he snarled, pulling her in front of him as a shield. He drew his pistol and pressed it to her temple. The saloon erupted in panic. Men scrambled for cover, overturning tables. "Nobody moves." Blackwood screamed, his eyes wild. "It's true, Caldwell. All of it. Your father destroyed my family. He murdered my father and got away with it. I've spent 20 years waiting for this. I took everything from you piece by piece. Your home, your future. And now?" He tightened his grip on Josephine, his knuckles digging into her arm. "Now I take the one thing you can't live without." Outside, the wind began to howl. The dust of the plains, whipped into a frenzy, began to lash against the windows. A sandstorm, sudden and violent, was descending on the town, trapping them all in this powder keg of a room. The lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. The clock on the wall ticked each second an eternity. Yates stood his ground, his hands held out open and non-threatening. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice was steady. "Let her go, Blackwood. This is between you and me. It always has been." "There is no you and me anymore," Blackwood spat. "There's only me winning." Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension from the back of the room. "Not yet, there isn't." John Morgan stepped out of the shadows, a shotgun held steady in his hands. He hadn't been broken after all. He'd been waiting. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The old man comes to play hero. You think I'm afraid of you. You foolishly hired the son of your own doom. Did you know Morgan? Did you have any idea the serpent you welcomed into your home?" Morgan's eyes met Yates's, and in them Yates saw not surprise, but a deep, weary sadness. "I knew," Morgan said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've known for years who your father was, son. I knew about the feud." The secondary twist landed on Yates with the force of a physical blow. Morgan had known all along. "Why?" Yates breathed. "Because Blackwood was trying to ruin me long before you showed up." Morgan explained, his gaze never leaving Blackwood. "I needed a foreman who wouldn't just work for the ranch. I needed one who had a reason to fight for it. A personal stake. I needed a Caldwell to fight a Blackwood. It was a gamble. I'm sorry I used you, son. But I was a desperate man." The confession hung in the air, another layer of betrayal in a story built on them. But there was no time for anger. Blackwood was growing more agitated, the pressure of the gun increasing against Josephine's temple. The sandstorm raged outside, the wind shrieking like a banshee. The saloon was dim, the world reduced to this single desperate standoff. Yates knew he had one chance. "You're right, Blackwood," Yates said, taking a slow step forward. "My father was a hard man. Maybe he did wrong by yours. That debt is mine to pay. Not hers, not Morgan's. Mine." He took another step. "Let her go, and you can have me. An eye for an eye, A son for a son. Blackwood hesitated, his twisted logic momentarily swayed by the biblical justice of the offer. His eyes darted between Yates and Morgan. In that split second of distraction, Josephine acted. She stomped down hard on Blackwood's instep with the heel of her boot. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Yates needed. He lunged forward, not at Blackwood, but knocking Josephine to the floor out of the line of fire. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Morgan's shotgun roared its blast, echoing like thunder. Blackwood's pistol fired the bullet, going wild, shattering the mirror behind the bar. Blackwood staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He clutched his chest, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. He looked at Yates, his lips moving, but no sound came out. Then he crumpled to the floor. Silence descended on the saloon, broken only by the howling of the wind and Josephine's ragged sobs. The sandstorm raged on, but inside the long, violent storm between the Caldwells and the Blackwoods was finally over. The storm passed as dawn broke, washing the world clean. In the quiet of the saloon, with Blackwood's body covered and the sheriff on his way back, the 3 survivors sat at a dusty table, the silence heavy with the night's revelations. "I should have told you," Yates Morgan said, his voice raspy with exhaustion and regret. He looked every one of his years, the weight of his deception pressing down on him. It wasn't right using your past against his. But I was backed into a corner. He was a cancer, and I saw in you the only cure. Yates looked at the old man, who had been a father to him, who had given him a home and a purpose, and who had, in the end, saved his life. The anger he might have felt was absent, replaced by a weary understanding. You did what you had to do to survive. Out here, that's the only rule that matters. He glanced at Josephine, who was huddled in his coat, her hand resting on his arm. We all did. Josephine looked at Morgan, her eyes clear. You saved us, John. You saved both of us. A fragile peace settled between them, a foundation built on shared trauma and hard-won truths. The journey back to the ranch was a quiet one. The land scoured by the storm seemed new, a blank slate. As they crested the familiar rise, the ranch came into view. The burned-out shell of the barn stood as a monument to their struggle, but the main house was solid and welcoming smoke curling from its chimney. It was still home. That afternoon, Morgan called them into his study. He laid a piece of paper on the desk. It wasn't a deed of sale. It was a partnership agreement. The ranch is as much yours as it is mine now, he said, his voice firm. You earned it. Both of you. You saved it. Now help me rebuild it. Tears welled in Josephine's eyes. Yates could only knot his throat too tight for words. 2 weeks later, they were married by the circuit judge in Morgan's parlor. It was a simple ceremony with Mrs. Abernathy and a few of the ranch hands as witnesses. Josephine wore a borrowed dress, and Yates wore his only suit. But as they exchanged their vows, their hands linked, they were not just building a future, but reclaiming a past that had been stolen from them. Their life together took on the rhythm of the seasons. They rebuilt the barns stronger than before. They restocked the herds. Laughter returned to the main house, chasing away the ghosts. Under their combined care, the ranch thrived. A year to the day after the showdown in the saloon, Yates and Josephine rode out to the far edge of the territory. The prairie grass was high-waving in the gentle breeze. They stopped at the forgotten cemetery, the 2 crooked headstones still standing against the endless sky. Yates dismounted and walked to the weathered marker that read, Elias Blackwood. The cycle of violence had begun here with an act of greed and a desperate man's death. It had echoed down through the years, costing lives and poisoning the land. It had to end here, too. He reached down and placed a single wild prairie rose on the dusty earth of the grave. It was a small gesture, a silent apology for his father's sins, an act of forgiveness for the son's. It was a promise that this ground would not be watered with blood again. Josephine watched him, her hand resting on her gently swelling abdomen. She smiled, a look of profound love and peace on her face. Yates returned to her side, swinging up into his saddle. He took her hand, and together they turned their horses toward home, riding away from the shadows of the past and into the warm, bright promise of their future.